For decades, the world has treated the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as a frozen dispute, tragic but contained. But in the past few days, something has shifted. Britain, Australia, and Canada have recognized a Palestinian state. At the United Nations, momentum is building for a two-state solution, while Gaza burns under Israeli strikes and regional powers maneuver for position. For the first time in years, the idea of Palestinian sovereignty is moving from the margins to the mainstream. But here is the question that matters. Is this the beginning of a breakthrough, or the spark of a wider confrontation that could redraw the entire Middle East? The recognition of a Palestinian state by Britain, Australia, and Canada is more than a diplomatic gesture. It signals that something is shifting in the international consensus. At the United Nations, momentum is building behind the two-state solution, while Israel's leadership insists it will never allow such a step. Gaza is under bombardment, Palestinian casualties keep rising, and regional powers like Iran and Egypt are watching closely. In this video, we will break down why these recognitions are happening now, what they could mean for Israel's security and regional stability, how Washington is caught between allies and domestic pressures, and why this debate could set the stage for either compromise or a deeper confrontation. If you want to follow how this turning point could reshape the Middle East and America's role in it, stay with us, and if you value analysis like this, subscribe now so you do not miss what comes next. For decades, the two-state solution has been the official formula repeated in speeches, summits, and resolutions. But on the ground, it looked like a slogan frozen in time. Settlements expanded, negotiations collapsed, and each new war in Gaza made the idea feel more distant. Yet in the last few days, something has shifted. Britain, Australia, and Canada have recognized Palestine as a state, joining a growing list of countries that no longer want to wait for a final deal to act. According to Reuters, this wave of recognitions is being presented as a way to restart diplomacy. But for Israel, it looks like a direct challenge to its position. Prime Minister Netanyahu has already said that Palestinian statehood will not happen. And in Israeli politics, this hard line is echoed across the spectrum. That clash between international momentum and Israeli refusal is what makes this moment different from the past. It is no longer only about peace talks that may or may not restart. It is about a legitimacy battle unfolding in real time, with governments openly taking sides. And if that legitimacy shifts further, it could reshape not only the Palestinian issue, but the entire balance of power in the Middle East. The question is whether this is just symbolic, or whether symbolism itself is now becoming the weapon. The question is not why the world has debated a Palestinian state for decades. The question is why the debate is erupting now. Timing is everything. After nearly a year of relentless war in Gaza, the stream of images showing devastation and civilian suffering has shifted public opinion in ways that leaders cannot ignore. Governments that once preferred silence are now under pressure from their own citizens, from parliaments, and from the streets. According to Reuters, more than 100 countries already back formal recognition, and the recent step by Britain, Australia, and Canada has transformed the conversation. These are not marginal players. They are core members of the Western Alliance, the same capitals that usually move in lockstep with Washington. Their recognition is not just a gesture, it is a signal that patience with the status quo is running out. At the same time, the United Nations is preparing a high-level summit where diplomats describe an unusual sense of momentum. The two-state solution, dismissed for years as a diplomatic ghost, suddenly looks like the only framework capable of breaking the cycle of destruction. For Israel, this is a moment of acute pressure. Its government insists recognition will only harden conflict, but every new country that extends recognition chips away at its argument. For the Palestinians, it is a rare surge of international legitimacy at a time when the realities on the ground have never looked worse. Recognition may not build borders or remove checkpoints, but it alters the political map in ways that are hard to reverse. And then there is the United States. For decades, Washington has been the gatekeeper of the peace process. insisting that statehood can only come through direct negotiations. But as its closest allies move without it, the U.S. risks being left behind. This is the turning point. If recognition spreads, Washington must choose: align with its partners and accept a shift it has resisted, or hold the line and risk looking like the last obstacle to a solution much of the world now views as inevitable. That choice will not stay confined to the Middle East. The political ground is shifting, and the acceleration is unmistakable. What begins as a diplomatic step in New York could ripple outward, reshaping alliances, testing U.S. influence, and forcing a confrontation between principle and realpolitik. Recognition changes headlines, but it does not change the ground. In legal terms, nothing shifts overnight. There are no new borders, no new treaties, no sudden withdrawal of troops. Yet in politics, symbols are power. Every government that recognizes a Palestinian state gives the Palestinian Authority more weight, more legitimacy, and more space to argue that it represents the path forward. At the same time, it chips away at Israel's core narrative that Palestine is not ready for statehood. This is why Jerusalem sees even symbolic recognition as dangerous. One recognition is a gesture. A wave of recognitions is momentum. And if Europe follows Britain, Canada, and Australia, pressure will grow on Washington to reconsider its stance. For Israel, the nightmare is not tomorrow's vote. It is the slow erosion of diplomatic ground that could one day leave it isolated in forums it once dominated. But recognition also carries a risk for Palestinians. If it spreads without concrete follow-up, it could become a hollow flag, celebrated in speeches, but empty in results. The question is whether this moment is the beginning of a real shift, or just another entry in the long record of symbolic victories. And that question leads to the deeper fault line. How will Israel, surrounded and pressured, choose to respond? On the ground, recognition has not slowed the war. Israel responded to the diplomatic wave with more airstrikes on Gaza and with promises to ignore any foreign decision on Palestinian statehood. Prime Minister Netanyahu framed the recognitions as irrelevant, arguing that security, not speeches, will determine the future. For Israel, the goal is clear: to show that outside declarations will not dictate its battlefield choices. Across the Arab world, reactions were warm but cautious. Leaders welcomed the recognitions, yet quickly stressed that words alone cannot stop bombs or rebuild destroyed cities. For them, the gap between symbolic gestures and material change is still wide. Within the West, the split is sharper. London took the lead, Washington stayed cautious, and European capitals debated whether to follow or wait. According to Reuters, some NATO officials worry that the alliance could look divided, just as Russia watches for weakness. Others argue the opposite, that showing multiple approaches could prove the alliance is resilient, not fractured. And this is the dilemma. Do these recognitions divide the West, or do they strengthen it by forcing a long-delayed debate into the open? The answer will shape not only the Middle East, but also the credibility of Western unity in a moment when that unity is being tested everywhere else. For Washington, the wave of recognitions does not land in a vacuum. It arrives in the middle of a political season already defined by division and fatigue. President Trump has framed himself as a deal maker who wants to avoid costly entanglements abroad, but the space for ambiguity is closing fast. At home, the electorate is split almost down the middle. Polling shows that younger Americans are more inclined to view recognition of Palestine as a step toward stability, while older voters and evangelical blocs frame it as a direct betrayal of Israel. That divide runs through Congress too, shaping funding debates and limiting the administration's room for maneuver. A president who thrives on projecting decisiveness now faces an issue where every choice risks alienating part of his own base. The foreign policy stakes are even sharper. Israel is not just another partner. It is a cornerstone of U.S. strategy in the Middle East, backed by billions in annual military aid and a web of intelligence cooperation that reaches into almost every crisis in the region. A rupture there would echo across decades of bipartisan policy. Yet hesitation carries its own cost. As Britain, Australia, and Canada move ahead, Washington risks being seen as reactive rather than leading. NATO allies are quietly asking whether the U.S. is still the agenda setter or just one voice among many. According to AP, Arab leaders are already calling for Washington to put substance behind its rhetoric on peace, warning that credibility is evaporating if America stands still while others act. This is the narrowing corridor that Trump faces. Push Israel too hard, and he risks an open break with a partner that anchors U.S. deterrence in the region. Hold back, and he risks being painted as the last obstacle to a peace process that much of the world is beginning to endorse. And unlike in past decades, the U.S. cannot easily compartmentalize this debate. It collides directly with other crises, from NATO's standoff with Russia in Europe to escalating competition with China in the Pacific. Stretching American bandwidth thinner could prove dangerous. The real danger is not just diplomatic awkwardness, it is fragmentation. If Washington loses the ability to balance support for Israel with alignment to its allies and credibility with Arab partners, the center of Western leadership begins to wobble. And if America cannot hold that center, who else in the West can? Or worse, who else might step in to fill the vacuum? The recognition of Palestine by major Western allies is not just another diplomatic gesture. It is the kind of move that can trigger momentum, and in diplomacy, momentum often matters more than numbers. According to Reuters, several European governments are already debating whether to align with Britain, Canada, and Australia. Once a few key capitals move, the pressure on others to follow grows. If that trend accelerates, Israel could find itself increasingly isolated in institutions where it once enjoyed near automatic support. The United Nations General Assembly, the European Union, even forums like the G20 could begin tilting in ways that erode Israel's ability to frame its own narrative. But the consequences extend far beyond Europe. China and Russia see an opening. Beijing has long positioned itself as a champion of global South causes, portraying itself as a power that listens to grievances the West dismisses. Recognition of Palestine offers it a ready stage. Moscow, facing isolation in Europe, is eager to exploit fractures within NATO and between Washington and its allies. Both powers can present themselves as alternative brokers, not because they intend to resolve the conflict, but because projecting influence in the Middle East weakens American leverage elsewhere. In that sense, the Palestinian cause risks being pulled into the broader chessboard of great power rivalry. For the Palestinians, broader recognition carries hope, but also danger. Each new endorsement strengthens their claim to legitimacy, yet each step also ties their future more tightly to the agendas of external powers. The more the conflict becomes a pawn in global competition, the harder it becomes to resolve on its own terms. And for Israel, that dynamic creates a harsher reality. Isolation does not necessarily change facts on the ground overnight, but it reshapes the international environment in which every future decision will be made. This is why the ripple effect matters. For years, Western capitals tried to push the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to the margins, focusing on Ukraine, China, and the Indo-Pacific. Now, recognition drags it back to the center, reframing it as a litmus test of Western credibility. Washington faces the prospect of balancing three theaters at once: a grinding war in Europe, a looming confrontation in Asia, and a resurgent crisis in the Middle East. Each one capable of spiraling beyond control, each demanding attention, resources, and resolve. The domino effect of recognition is not just about Palestine. It is about where the gravitational center of global tension shifts. And the more that center pulls back toward the Middle East, the more the United States will be forced to confront a conflict it has spent decades trying and failing to contain. For the first time in years, the two-state solution is being recognized not just as an abstract principle, but as a political act carried out by major Western governments. On paper, this looks like momentum. In practice, it risks widening the gap between words and reality. According to the BBC, Gaza remains under siege, the West Bank fractured, and negotiations frozen. Recognition may give Palestinians symbolic legitimacy, but it does not stop the bombs or remove a single checkpoint. That tension creates a dangerous paradox. The more the West promises a political horizon it cannot enforce, the more it risks fueling frustration instead of calming it. For Washington, the stakes are even higher. U.S. policy has long rested on being both Israel's closest ally and the global broker of peace. If America cannot translate symbolic gestures into concrete progress, it risks looking not just indecisive, but irrelevant. Rivals will notice. China will argue that U.S. influence in the Middle East is hollow. Russia will point to Western double standards. And the wider world will judge whether the alliance that claims to uphold international order can still deliver on its own rhetoric. The real question is not whether recognition matters. It does. The question is whether the gap between recognition and reality becomes another crack in Western credibility. Because in geopolitics, credibility is not a detail, it is the currency that decides whether promises deter war or invite challenge. And right now, that currency is being tested in the most volatile arena on Earth. In the end, the real weight of this moment is not in the declarations themselves, but in the signal they send. Recognition alone does not redraw borders or end wars, but it shifts the perception of what is possible, and perception is often the first step toward reality. If the map of the Middle East is ever to change, the conditions may be written not only on the ground in Gaza or the West Bank, but also in the halls of New York, London, and Ottawa. That is why this moment matters. It could mark the opening of a new chapter or the widening of another gap between rhetoric and reality. And history shows that in this region, gaps like that do not stay empty for long. They are filled either by diplomacy or by violence. Which path emerges from here is the question no one can yet answer. So, what do you think? Does recognition of a Palestinian state bring the world closer to peace, or is it just another promise that risks being broken? Tell us in the comments, and if you want to keep following how today's decisions shape tomorrow's conflicts, make sure to subscribe so you do not miss what comes next.